So what is leadership? And really when we ask that question, we should answer it partially by looking at what does it take to be an effective leader in today's 21st century education environment. And so we like to think of leadership as being a way to motivate people to accomplish an objective. And that's extremely important today. So I'm Bernard Gibson. I'm going to speak to you about 21st century community college institutional leadership and why it's so important. And one of the things that I want to focus on today is the fact that we actually have a scenario where leadership is about having enough artists in a scenario where we don't have institutionally and academically enough people to fill the realm. So think about it like this. If we had more artists, we would not only be better at our craft in regard to leadership, but we'd also put ourselves in a position to pass those skills along to others so that we create generations of people who were more effective leaders. So with that note, let's talk a little bit about this 21st century leadership opportunity and specifically focus in on why community college CEOs leave and is there anything that can be done about it. This is part of the Bridge Building Leadership, Senior Leadership series that I've put together. Hopefully it will give you some insight. The first thing I normally like to do is to kind of scope the problem, take a look at leadership and kind of understand by asking questions, how do we frame this particular problem that we have? And one way to do that is to ask ourselves questions like, how many open positions at a college or district might a CEO have? Is this a complex or simple situation? And to give you some background there, when you look at leadership on your campus, is it a single campus district? Is it a multi-campus district? Are you tied to US or UC or CSU type of institutions within the state? Another question I like to ask is, what is your strategy and your timeline to kind of complete your top 3 initiatives? And how have you taken those initiatives and been able to apply them and hand them off to the folks that are most important in your leadership realm on your campus? One other question I like to pose sometimes, have you identified your college or district leadership champions? And I'll talk more about the champions, but these are the people who actually can see the strategy and then can help get implementation. So it's not just your visionaries who might be part of your executive team, it's also the people who can get things implemented and done for you. So let's move forward a little bit in our discussion. So the question that gets posed after we start to frame the problem a little bit is, why is it that CEOs are leaving? And part of what we've seen here is that there's tension. So there can be a little bit of tension between the board of directors, the board of governors, the board of trustees, depending upon how your governance is set up in your particular college or district. And with that tension, we can say that it's not a bad thing, it's just that you have tension there and you need to be aware of it. You might have tension with the faculty within your institution or within your district. And that could be a collective as well if you have a multi-college district. And then what leadership programs and mentoring is being conducted on your particular college campus or within your district. And what I mean by that is that, are there programs and is there mentoring as a function of those programs to help develop people? Because if they're not, and that structure and framework is not in place, it may be more difficult for you as a CEO to figure out how to effectively get your organization moving, how to get it jump-started and motivated to sustain that type of performance and productivity. Job preparation, so it could be very difficult to be able to figure out how to be able to not only sustain these jobs that you get into, but more importantly, how to get other people prepared for these jobs. And that can be a Herculean task as a CEO if you are faced with having to develop a whole new staff, or if you're hiring a portion of your staff in order to get them prepared to do the work that they need to do. And then one of the big ones is expectations. So as a CEO, how are you putting out expectations within your organization? And just as importantly, when we start talking about what drives CEOs to leave, what expectations are being placed on you when you are going and trying to be effective in what you do? One other piece that I like to speak about in regard to why CEOs are leaving, and I'll give more background and a different training in regard to this, is really looking at the 83% rule. And so this is some research that I've done, and what I did was I polled some CEOs to figure out where they spent the majority of their time. But specifically, I didn't ask them in regard to their time. I asked their AAs, where were they spending their scheduled time? And so that scheduled time, meaning when you look at their calendars, how much of that time is spent on meetings? And when I focused in on meetings, one of the things I found was that there were scheduled meetings that were on their campuses, and then there were scheduled meetings that were off their campuses, and then there was travel time. So in essence, almost dead time. And if you can believe it or not, more than 80% of their time was being spent in meetings. And even though this was a small survey, I think it's indicative of how much work is actually placed on a CEO's plate that's actually in meetings, where there may or may not be decisions made, actions taken, implementation put into place. And then that means that also in the discussion, the other 17%, what happens there? What are people doing with that little bit of time to actually run their organizations? So we ask ourselves next, what can be done in this realm? And so a couple of things to think about as a CEO. And you have to understand your role in being effective. And team building is so important if you want to be successful. How have you constructed the team? And so some CEOs are put in positions where they are working as the chief fundraiser for their organization, and then their executive team is left to be able to run the institution or the district itself. Some CEOs like to or prefer to, because of their background, to be in charge of running the institution, and then someone else has the majority of the task in regard to fundraising. It's very difficult to do both tasks effectively, so how do you prep and put your team together to be successful when you're trying to get a handle on running that organization? And that's a big question and a point that you would have to consider. Quality traits. Are you aligned in regard to who your champions are? Remember what I said about the champions. These are people that can see at the strategic level where you want to go from a visionary standpoint, and then can get implementation at the tactical level where you are going to be a student to front counter employee or whoever you're servicing type of relationship. They're able to get in there and make sure that it gets implemented in a way that is in sync with the vision that you have. Exceptional change management ability is one of the skills that's very important in regard to this, and then raising the opportunity and resources for student success. And your colleges are probably faced with a lot of initiatives right now. Guided pathways, promise programs of a number of different flavors, multiple measures, just to name a few. And then there's those institutional programs that have long been a part and a staple of the culture of your organization, and how those continue to survive in that process. So this quality trait of alignment is very important. How are you aligning these functions, not only in your mind, but with the resources and the champions that you have on your campus or in your institution? Communication skills, paramount. They really are designed in a number of different ways. I think today in the 21st century, a lot of us are using email as a primary tool for communication. It's fast, somewhat effective. It puts us in a position where we don't have to be concerned about the message getting out. The challenge is that it also puts us in a position where we don't necessarily get feedback, we don't have interface, and more importantly, we don't have room to take that communication, that data, aggregate it, put it into a format that's usable, and then get that proper implementation that we talked about in regard to quality trait alignment. Another thing to think about is, have you tailored your leadership to the culture that you are leading? So sometimes we come into these scenarios and we think these are the things I want to get done, but the culture of the institution and the community and the college doesn't operate that way. So how do you blend those two? So you really need to think in terms of, in your organization, am I putting the framework and the structure together that not only helps my institution survive, but more importantly, helps me sustain my time and tenure there with the college as well. And then last but not least, really this 21st century leadership paradigm. So team formulation, influence, goal implementation with some level of intensity is extremely important, and one of the things we want to think about in regard to how we are able to be effective as CEOs. So we catch our breath for a minute and we start to think about how are we going to frame these things in regard to why are CEOs leaving? We've got a little bit of the problem that we've scoped. We looked at the problem itself. We started posing questions. Now we're getting into some potential solutions that seem to be indirect, but quite frankly, pose a great opportunity for us by not only asking the questions, but then looking for our staff and the leadership at our organizations and institutions to help us answer. So, one of the things that I put together here is this leadership framing. And I think that this is very important. It's a 3-phase leadership model. And if you look at the first year in phase 1, we're really looking toward assessment, leadership team building, identifying who the champions are. And you can take a year to do that. Or if you're already a CEO at your college or at your district or your institution, you might take 6 months to do that. So this can work whether it's on the annual basis or whatever time frame you're working with it. Year 2 is phase 2, we're looking at the influence stage, the resource and goal development stage. So now that we know who the champions are, we're pushing our organization through our leadership champions, and then the resource and goal development starts to solidify for organization. This is extremely important because in this phase, we start to really build the culture and how we operate. And if we've got a culture that already was in existence and we're bringing in the culture that we would like to see us be moving forward, we've got to have this blending and transitioning that is so important from a leadership standpoint. And then year or phase 3, implementation. So we put ourselves in a position to actually take some actions and put things into place that are going to help us sustain ourselves over time. 3-phase leadership model, not predicated on just the year, but more importantly, if you were to start today as a CEO and you decided, you know what, I think I want to implement some of this thought process in how I go about developing leadership and changing the culture on my campus, and then hoping that I'm able to stay and see that sustained, I could hit the reset button. And reset can be done at any time. And I think that it also applies to the leadership, executive leadership in your campus as well. What reset means is that you've got the opportunity to start over. You've just take the time to explain why and what you're starting over about and why that's going to be important to those who are going to be impacted the most. So this takes a little bit of time for preparation in regard to putting the framework together, whether it's on an annual basis or a phase basis. But more importantly, it keeps you from doing more work on the back end after the fact, which a lot of times can be detrimental to the cause and to the organization. So expectations, I want to talk a little bit about those. Organic development of our leadership champions into potential CEOs. So part of our role in making sure that we get to stay is to make sure that we are developing the people who will run this college long after we're gone and can sustain the mission and take it on to the next level as they might see it. This is a critical piece because this support mechanism means that if you are away fundraising, or you might be at meetings, or you might be doing something else, you can be assured that your staff is leading in the manner that not only you see fit, but more importantly works toward what the institution and the district sees fit. Organizational stabilization. So I'm looking at making sure that while I'm doing this, I like to use the word that you're not jerking or pulling the institution around. So you don't pull it in one direction one year and then pull it in a different direction the next year. You have a stabilized foundation you work from, and then that allows you to take small amounts of change, even when you have large initiatives, and then be able to take them and break them down and put them into tangible, usable pieces for people so that they understand why the change is important. Individual and collective gratification. People like to know that they are doing a good job and the people they're working with are doing a good job. And part of the way to do that is involve them in the process so that then they are not reliant upon the CEO in order to deliver the message that the job was well done. Develop a process for sustainability and make that a part of what you do. Make sure you're encasing the institution's culture, as I've alluded to previously, in what you do. And then distribute responsibility to folks on a consistent basis. This allows us to demonstrate our effectiveness and our productivity long term and really becomes important. And it's not a delegation or a handing off that we're doing. What we're doing is saying that if we had initiatives and work that was being done on your campus, like the initiatives I led to earlier, how are we distributing that responsibility in an effective way where people feel like they own it and they make a difference in how the outcome comes out in regard to that? So this is a point where there would be probably a number of questions, and we'd start the dialogue to map out and frame what this 21st century community college leadership would look like. And so you design or start to design the model that helps you build this particular framework. And you kind of ask yourself, where do you start in regard to that? And that's the next part of the training in the series that we get to, is into that starting point and that discussion.